Hey guys, how you doing? Chapter 15, the neurocognitive disorders. So, unlike the neurodevelopmental disorders, which we discussed last time, these are disorders that are not a process of the development of the person's brain. These are not a result of problems in the womb or with development of the brain. These are things that occur later in life. Sometimes the neurocognitive disorders occur as the person reaches an advanced age. Sometimes that can happen. And sometimes they can happen even to relatively young people, but through trauma. And I don't mean psychological trauma, I mean through physical trauma. The neurocognitive disorders, even though they do affect the psychology of the person, are brain-based disorders. So when we're talking about these things, we're talking about diseases of the brain that, and treatment for those does involve therapy. It does involve some type of skills training very often, and a lot of that has to deal with coping and teaching people how to deal with the emergence of the disorders, and teaching family members how to deal with the emergence of the disorders, how to keep people safe. And there is some medication too that sometimes can be helpful. So we'll start with the idea of a neurocognitive disorder major and a neurocognitive disorder mild. So as the name sounds or describes, a neurocognitive disorder can come in the mild or major variety. And the difference between the two is the amount of impact that the disorder has on a person's memory and cognition. Cognition, you will recall, is your thinking, your ability to process thought and make rational thought and use logic and those sorts of things. So one of the first and major effects that we see when somebody starts to express symptoms of one of these neurocognitive disorders is an impediment to their memory. Sometimes that is really, really severe, to the point where the person can't remember where they live, who they are, who their family members are, those sorts of things. Sometimes it comes and goes. Sometimes they can remember where they live. Sometimes they can't remember where they live. And then sometimes it's relatively minor. They have trouble keeping track of things in the short-term memory. You know, I just told you this, but you can't remember it. Or they have trouble keeping track of things in the long-term memory. Interestingly enough, when we see people start to develop the memory problems associated with neurocognitive disorders, very often it's the more recent memory that seems to be affected. And that more recent memory can go back a few years, but the historic archival memory that a person may have, where they went to grade school, the kindergarten, when they met their wife, if they're in their, their 80s or 90s, when they met their wife in their 20s or 30s, all that stuff might stay intact, but it's for some reason the stuff in the last few years that seems to go away. That's not always the case. People, there are cases where people literally forget everything. Memory is an odd feature of the human brain and the human mind, and we don't get a chance really to talk about it in this class all that much, except how disorders impact it. But if you get a chance, as you go through your classes and lessons, if you get a chance to pick up some education on memory, do so, because it is really interesting, and it's weird how it actually works. But anyway, so mild neurocognitive disorders are going to have a mild effect on memory loss and cognitive ability. Major neurocognitive disorders, major effect on memory loss and cognitive ability. And very often, mild neurocognitive disorders progress into major neurocognitive disorders. Not always, but they can. So just because it's mild doesn't mean it won't become major. Unfortunately, it doesn't tend to go in the other direction. So the first one we're going to talk about is delirium, because it's kind of the basis, the foundation for all the other neurocognitive disorders. When you get into the other disorders like dementia and neurocognitive, we don't just call it Alzheimer's anymore. Now it's neurocognitive with Alzheimer's. It's neurocognitive with Parkinson's. It's neurocognitive with Hastings. We used to just call it Alzheimer's, Hastings, Parkinson's. But we have to make everything longer and more difficult as time goes on. So delirium is kind of the foundation. And delirium is just just that. It's the effect on memory and cognition. When we see a significant and substantial deficit in a subject's memory, and this deficit is higher than it has been in the past, because everybody forgets things, and as you get older, you got more stuff in there, so stuff becomes easier to forget. But it's a marked, significant decrease in memory, and not just the loss of memories that you've had, but the inability to retain current memories. So I tell you a phone number and you cannot keep it, or I tell you our new address and you can't remember it. I tell you the name of your new grandchild and you cannot remember it. Things that should be important to you. Not everyone is going to remember the BitLocker key to get into their Microsoft account, but to be able to remember your home address, for instance, or to remember your firstborn son's name, your first grandson's name, those kind of things. So we're talking about significant memory loss. Cognitive ability. We start seeing cognitive interruptions occur. We start seeing interruptions in a person's ability to think and process thought. And very often this will come out first in their speech, and you'll see the person start to stutter and have an inability to get thoughts to their mouth and out into the world. So they'll begin to formulate a thought, and they'll try and speak it, but somewhere between here and here, it gets broken up, and they start to stutter, and the words don't come out right, or it comes out as a mash of sounds that aren't really words. But we also see this when they have a person with cognitive disorders will have problems doing higher order functions like math, and that can be simple math problems like 2 + 2. They'll have trouble making change or giving change or handing the clerk enough money to pay for whatever it is they're buying. And they will have difficulties problem solving and thinking and doing those sorts of things. This can be major, to where the person can't remember how to take their medicine, can't remember how to shower, cannot figure out the process by which one feeds themselves, right? Or it can be relatively minor, they no matter how many times we show you, you just cannot figure out how to work the DVD player or the Blu-ray player. So there is some neurocognitive decline with age anyway. That just happens. I like to joke about how older people, they can't grasp technology. They can't do this or that. Comedians like to joke about it all the time. But if you think about it from a rational perspective, there really is no reason that a person who is of advanced age couldn't use technology, right? I mean, why wouldn't they be able to use technology? They've been around longer. They've been using the stuff longer than you have, right? And as long as they keep purchasing it and keep up with it, why would they ever not suddenly be able to use it? And some of this may have to do with neurocognitive decline. It's not that the technology is beyond them, it's that they are no longer up to the technology. And again, this doesn't happen to everybody, but there is some level of neurocognitive decline as brain cells die as you get older. So that's delirium, memory and cognitive impairment. When we have delirium and it's accompanied with false beliefs, with delusions, with hallucinations, with breaks from reality, there can be psychotic delirium. We can go into dementia, which is a more significant impairment of the brain's ability to function, problem solve, and remember. And when we talk about these things, I talk about people like elderly people with dementia. What does that mean? You're talking about somebody who may have been a CEO of a company, or a lawyer, or a doctor, or fought in World War II, or did something amazing. They may have been an astronaut, or so you're talking about somebody who may have been at the very top of their game, and all of a sudden they can't remember how to bathe themselves. The problem is not just that they are suffering this neurocognitive decline, But it is also that very often they are aware that they are suffering a neurocognitive decline. This isn't just a case of, oh, grandma doesn't remember her address, oh, that's so silly. This is tragic because grandma doesn't remember her address and she knows she should, right? Because she used to be an accountant and she knows that she should be able to remember all kinds of numbers, right? So with this type of neurocognitive decline also comes a lot of psychological issues like depression, like anxiety, like fear. I mean, imagine all of a sudden you woke up, if you woke up tomorrow and you were in a country that you've never been in before and nobody spoke English anymore and nobody looked like you anymore. You woke up in a completely different place, right? Well, that can be what it's like if you have dementia and you wake up in the morning and your memory and cognition have left you, even if it's for a temporary period of time. You don't know where you're at. You don't know who you are. You don't know who anybody is. That can be terrifying, right? So, and then of course there's the physical risk that comes along with this. Very often persons with dementia or who are in the throes of delirium will wander away from places they're supposed to be, not through an attempt to be difficult or try to make life hard for anybody, but because they just don't realize what they're doing. And we've seen people wander into traffic. We've seen people out when it's 30 degrees outside, because not everywhere's Hawaii where it's 70 degrees all year, right? Where it's 30 degrees and snowing outside and they're out wandering around in their pajamas and stuff and they're suffering hypothermia, or they haven't eaten in 5 days, or they don't know that they need to clean themselves and go to the bathroom. And so they've been making waste on themselves. Especially when a person suffering from this stuff is living by themselves. This can be a life-threatening situation, and that's why there are elder care portions of the government. Just like there's CPS, there's also APS, Adult Protective Services, that can hopefully step in and help in those situations. Care for people in this situation, unfortunately, if it is a systemic or not systemic, if it is a progressive neurocognitive decline, is not a really good prognosis for healing. There are some medications out there that may be able to slow the decline, but at the end of the day, we're talking about a disease of the brain and the structures of the brain. And once it starts, it does not tend to get better. So, and that is very unfortunate. And I'm sure some of the people watching this have had a loved one, an auntie or an uncle or a grandma or grandpa with one of these diseases, and just how tragic and debilitating it can be. And it's sad, but we are constantly trying to find ways to slow it or stop it before it ever even happens. And there has been some progress made in things that you can do before the onset of certain neurocognitive disorders to prevent them from happening or delay their onset. We'll talk about that here in a second. So as far as some of the specific neurocognitive disorders, first let me explain when I say a neurocognitive decline, what I mean. So you may have heard the lie or the myth that humans only use 10% of their brain, right? That is complete crap. Every part of your brain is used. Not every part of your brain is used at all times, just like not every part of your body is used at all times. I'm sitting down in a chair. I'm not using my legs, okay? I'm using my mouth and I'm using my head and I'm using my eyes. But that doesn't mean I don't use my legs. So yeah, there's this lie out there, and there's been movies based on it and stuff. What if she used her whole brain? We all use our whole brain, okay? If you only use 10% of your brain, you're not, I don't know that that's enough to even make your heart work, to be honest with you. So let's get that out of the way. So you use your whole brain. Every part of your brain is important, okay? You just don't use the whole thing at the same time. There was a belief a long time ago that once brain cells died or were destroyed or were damaged, they never repaired and they never grew back. That brain cells were unique insofar that they did not ever come back. Also not true. In fact, the brain has an incredible ability to heal itself. In fact, in young people, when I say young, I mean like infant age, we have seen cases where the part of the brain that would say be in charge of speech gets ablated, which is a fancy word for saying destroyed in an accident or whatever. But because the brain is so young, the other parts of the brain will create the cells necessary to remanufacture that part of the brain and take over, and the person ends up with totally normal speech centers and can speak and do everything normal. The brain is amazing at healing itself and picking up the slack for parts of the brain that don't seem to work. You've all kind of heard the urban legend or the myth that when somebody loses a sense, like for instance their sight, if they have blindness, that their other senses get stronger and take over. Well, that's not technically true, but in a way, those parts of the brain that are in charge of the other senses do tend to pick up the slack a little bit, and you attune to them more. So while you don't suddenly get super hearing if you go blind, it is true that now your brain is going to be more attuned to the other senses that it needs to survive. So again, your brain, freaking amazing. It heals through a process we call plasticity. Maybe you know that. Maybe know that in like the next couple of weeks. Plasticity, which sounds like plastic, which sounds like it's stretchiness, is named the way it is for a reason, because the brain is so flexible at filling in its gaps and filling in its holes and repairing itself. What we've discovered is there's actually kind of a set number of brain cells that you have. And some of those brain cells are kind of held in reserve. They're like kept in the bank up there. And if there's damage to the brain, those cells get sent in to repair it and take care of it. Okay? So what we see in people who are of advanced age is all those plasticity cells have been used up by the time they reach their 70s or their 80s. And so now when the brain starts to get sick or suffer damage, there's no more cells that it has to use to heal itself. So while the brain has those backup cells, its plasticity is amazing. When it runs out, it runs out. And this is where we start to see the neurocognitive problems start to develop, because when parts of the brain start to die, when neurons start to die, remember the nerves and the synapse gap and the stuff bouncing around in between them, right? When one of those dies and there's no connection, that connection doesn't exist anymore. And if there's no plasticity to backfill that and heal those brain neurons, then that's a section of the brain that you're just going to lose. And so what you start to see is the brain operating kind of like a computer with too many windows open, right? Because there's not enough RAM to deal with all the demands on the processor, so everything starts to slow down, right? And some things will stall out, and maybe the whole system will crash. Okay, that's plasticity. That's how the brain repairs itself, and that in kind of a nutshell is kind of the origin point for things like delirium and dementia. And some of these neurocognitive decline that we have. How does this happen? Like, is everyone destined for this? No. For instance, I'll give you an example from my own life. My own father, he had a heart condition which lowered the amount of oxygen that he got into his body. His heart didn't pump enough blood around, so not enough oxygen got around his body. And as this went on over the years in his advanced life, the brain was not getting enough oxygen. Because the brain was not getting enough oxygen, the cells in the brain were starting to decay and die. And he was of an advanced enough age that there wasn't enough plasticity to come in and repair those cells. So as his heart condition progressed, it began to affect his cognition. And then when his kidneys started to go bad, it made the situation worse, because what little blood and what little oxygen that he was able to pump around was not getting filtered through his kidneys properly, and not being properly separated from toxins and stuff. So here you have a situation where you have a man with a heart issue and a kidney issue, and it's causing dementia. And if I just said that to you, oh yeah, my dad has dementia because he has bad kidneys, well, that doesn't make any sense, right? But it actually does make a lot of sense, because the body is systemic. Everything works together. So when we start seeing these things occur, the best thing we can do is immediately start seeking treatment and advice, because unfortunately, 9 times out of 10, it's going to get better before it gets worse. Sometimes we can stop it. If doctors have been able to magically heal my father's heart and kidneys, they maybe could have stopped further damage happening. The damage that had happened had already happened. But maybe we could have stopped further damage from happening. Maybe a little plasticity he had left could have gotten in there and done some healing. But again, when this stuff happens, it's kind of a downhill slope. And unfortunately, it's not a very gradual one. It tends to start slow and then get steeper and steeper and steeper and then start going really fast. And I'm sorry if that's depressing, and I'm sorry if that's not very good news, but things we can do to forestall it and hold it off. Science has told us that if we do things in our life that challenge our brain and force our brain to build new neural pathways all the time, it can help perhaps forestall. There's some correlative studies out there that could say they could forestall or put off some of this stuff, because the brain's pathways, the brain knows more than one way to get the job done. You have a pathway to make something happen that goes from here to here, but through the use of novel activity, constant learning, challenging yourself, picking up a new hobby, taking a different route to work, these kind of things, you force a new neural pathway to be built. So the brain learns now 2 different ways to get the job done. And so when one of these fails, the other one still exists. That is a super simple way to explain the neurobiology of dementia and dementia with Alzheimer's. So delirium tends to be a state. The person is in delirium. So they may not have a prolonged neurocognitive issue that we are aware of, but all of a sudden they're displaying delirium. And that may end. The brain may figure out pathways around it and everything may be fine all of a sudden. So maybe they're in delirium for a couple hours, a couple days. Okay, it's still a signal that dementia is coming. Or the delirium may just stay, and at that point we're going to call it dementia. That being said, and to be honest with you, delirium, dementia, those are terms where you're splitting hairs. Again, we call them neurocognitive disorders. They're mild or they're major. And if Alzheimer's is a factor, we call it neurocognitive disorder with Alzheimer's. If it's Hastings, we call it neurocognitive with Hastings, neurocognitive with Parkinson's. So let's talk about the with part. And let's talk about Parkinson's. So Michael J. Fox. He was Marty McFly in the Back to the Future movies. Back when I was a kid, he was a teen heartthrob and a big-time comedic actor. Everybody loved Michael J. Fox. And then he went on to star in the Back to the Future movies, which are, classics. And then he went on to star in a couple sitcoms and stuff. But he developed Parkinson's. It was kind of at the height of his career. Parkinson's disease is so named after when you discover one of these diseases and we don't have a symptom or name for it already, you get to name it after yourself. Isn't that nice? You get to have a terrible disease named after you for the rest of your life. But so Dr. Parkinson discovered a major neurocognitive disorder with Parkinson's. Parkinson's is a specific type of neurocognitive disorder, comes with the memory problems, comes with the cognitive problems because neural pathways are being destroyed, but it also comes with motor function problems, specifically the parts of the brain that control involuntary motor function are being destroyed. And so you see people with Parkinson's, they will begin, and they usually start small. They'll begin with tremors in like a hand or a foot or something that they can't control. And over time, that will start to spread throughout their entire body, and they will lose the ability to speak, and they become unable to stop shaking all over their body. And it's very physically debilitating. There was a thing at Comic-Con this year. I think it was Comic-Con. Yeah, I'm a geek, so what? I think it was Comic-Con, where Michael J. Fox, who played Marty McFly, reunited with the guy who played Doc Brown, and they hugged on stage, and all the fans were crazy. But Michael J. Fox went from being this young, kind of heartthrob actor from my day to now he can't even really stand up without help, and he can't speak anymore. He's still very active on Twitter through use of technology. He's able to get 140 characters out, kind of like Stephen Hawking did with his electronic speech thing. But and he's very much an advocate of trying, obviously, to help other people with Parkinson's because he has the money and the resources to do it. But, you know, it's sad and it's debilitating, and it struck him very early in life. Generally, when we see Parkinson's, we're talking about an advanced stage scenario. Alzheimer's is probably the most famous of the neurocognitive variants. So Alzheimer's syndrome, and it's not Alzheimer's, it's not old timers, it's Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's comes with a whole host of symptoms in addition to the major neurocognitive effects. Yes, it does target the memory, and it targets it in a devastating way. Yes, it does target the cognition, and it targets it in a devastating way. But it also creates psychological effects. It creates mood disorders. It creates mood changes. It creates personality changes in the person. And one of the key symptoms of Alzheimer's is a thing called aphasia or aphasia. Aphasia is a fancy way for saying the inability to speak properly. You'll see people with Alzheimer's lose the ability to have cogent speech. Sometimes they'll lose it on a periodic basis. Sometimes it goes away and it never comes back. They will try to talk. It will come out as a series of guttural sounds or mumbles or maybe even the wrong words. And I don't mean like a Freudian slip where you say one word where you mean the other. I mean like the whole sentence is a mishmash of words that don't go together, or sometimes they're sounds that don't go together, or sometimes they're just sounds where the person is desperately trying to speak, but the processing centers in the brain that control speech and cognition are broken now, and that's not going to work for them. People with Alzheimer's tend to suffer from anxiety. This is both caused by the brain disorder triggering the destruction of structures in the brain that control anxiety, and the situation, because you've got a person who is intelligent and has succeeded in life and is doing all the things right, and all of a sudden they cannot for the life of them remember their child's name, right? And that's going to cause some anxiety and also depression. And you can understand why, too, that would cause some major depression. So when you've got and all these things occurring, and aphasia, add to that severe cognitive impairment. Alzheimer's progresses nastily. It's very aggressive. And we have a host of medications that we've tried. Nothing is really all that effective, to be honest with you. And we try counseling, we try things, but most of the care that we have for Alzheimer's involves teaching the patient and the people around the patient how to deal with the progression of the disease. And there are researchers working around the clock trying to figure out how to put a stop to this thing, because it's bad, it's nasty. And if you have a family member with Alzheimer's, my heart goes out to you. And again, you know, you can do a little research as to some of the things that we've discovered are correlated with trying to forestall Alzheimer's from coming on. But all in all, nothing has been overly effective. So what causes these things? Well, I told you about advanced age and the death of brain structures. Disease can cause it. You can get infections that will travel into the brain and will cause it. In the case of my father, we have completely seemingly unrelated systemic diseases, kidney and heart problems that caused it. Physical trauma to the brain. When we see it in somebody who's not of advanced age, who hasn't run out of that plasticity, but for some reason it's not healing, we tend to be looking at somebody who's been involved in a serious accident, perhaps combat, or perhaps a vehicle accident, or severe sports injuries. Probably one of the most famous sports legends that suffered from neurocognitive disorder was Muhammad Ali. You know, we're talking about a guy who, you know, arguably the best boxer who ever lived, and a bad dude in the ring for sure. But you know, you can't get hit with the force of a semi-truck in the skull that long without suffering some severe damage to the brain, and eventually He wound up wheelchair bound with aphasia, inability to talk, inability to cognitively process things. When we have veterans, it doesn't have to be a veteran. It can be anybody, but a lot of the research is done on veterans because, well, they're kind of a captive population. We come back and they're easy to research. We have veterans who've seen combat and they've been around explosions and they suffer what we call a TBI, or traumatic brain injury. We see some cognitive disorders come out of those. And just like with Alzheimer's, you can see the mood changes, the personality changes. You know, having been in combat will change your personality. Anyway, I've been in combat and I understand, and it can change your personality anyway, but we see kind of extreme personality changes. We're like, this guy isn't this guy anymore. And what's happening, and sometimes the parts of the brain that control personality have been damaged due to the TBI. We see it with motorcycle accidents a lot, car accidents. So yeah, it can be due to disease. It can be directly a brain disease. It can be any other disease that somehow gets to affect the brain. Meningitis was a big one for it. It can be due to brain trauma. It also be due to substance abuse. You remember back when we were talking about bipolar, and then later on we were talking about methamphetamines, and I was talking about how that kind of chemically induced bipolar that methamphetamine causes. Yeah, that is damaging your brain. And every time you do that, you're killing the brain a little bit. And so you're creating a situation where you are setting yourself up for one of these neurocognitive impairments. I also told you, we are not aware of all the effects of the super high dose THC that we have now versus, our grandma and grandpa's marijuana. And we are concerned that there may be neurocognitive effects, that at that level, that it may be actually killing brain cells. I don't know that it is or it isn't. I'm not saying it does, but I'm saying that is something that's being looked into, because this is a much more concentrated dose than we were talking about before. So substance abuse can cause neurocognitive disorders too. Alcoholism, absolutely. Absolutely. And kind of worst of all is you can cause it in your kids, right? If you happen to be pregnant and you're abusing substances, you can affect the brain structures of the fetus and create and have a child born with neurocognitive disorders. At that point, it would be a neurodevelopmental disorder because they were born with it. So I should have covered it in the last section, but you understand the point. We've all heard the term, this came out in the 80s. This was a term that was used by the government a lot, like the idea of the crack baby. Well, what we call them in the real world is a drug-addicted infant. And children are born every day by the thousands in this country, born drug-dependent. They are born dependent on heroin, born dependent on methamphetamine, born dependent. And if you think that's hard for somebody with all their resources in place and as an adult to kick, as a kid, as an infant, that's not good. And, we see the damages that occur to their brain and no chance for that neurocognitive processes to even come into place. So again, it's technically neurodevelopmental, but you get the idea. So I'm sorry the news isn't better, and I'm sorry if this lecture is kind of a bummer, but that is kind of the gist that we want to cover on the neurocognitive disorders. All right, guys, see you on the next one.